this episode of the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about self-limiting beliefs. Both as tennis coaches and sports psychology coaches, it's very common to see athletes who, for a number of different reasons that we'll get into during this episode, they hold themselves back. And we'll get into why that might happen and some examples of how this manifests. But I think a good place to start this conversation is regarding mindset. Particularly having a fixed mindset or having a growth mindset, whether we see ourselves in a sort of a static way and that this is who we are in terms of our current level, or having the ability to improve at a number of different areas. As it relates to tennis, maybe that this could be certainly things related to our game in terms of the technical side, the strategic side, as well as the mental side. And I think we'll dive into a number of examples here. But Brian, you actually were the one that suggested this topic originally. Where do you start to think about this topic and how you see it with players that you work with?
I think fixed mindset is a good place to start, Josh. And as you said, sometimes we get in our own way with respect to limiting ourselves. And sometimes it can be also the environment we're in. Maybe other people are maybe pushing their views on us as to what they think we can do or we can't do, right? And usually I start the conversation with a discussion, because I think it also goes to the language that we use. And one of the biggest language issues that we see, it's maybe not exactly related to fixed mindset, but is the word can't. Now, everybody's familiar with the Henry Ford quote of, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. And I think we use this word a lot in tennis, and it could be used like, well, I can't beat that person, or I can't hit a kick serve. It could be related to something like that, right? And so when we have that sentence, automatically that becomes more or less our truth. And we may not push beyond that boundary. So if I say I can't hit a kick serve, what does that lead to? It generally leads to not even going to try anymore. Pretty much decided I can't hit it, and I'm done with that. And so a lot of it is talking to players about how this word works, what it is doing in our minds, and then bringing a little bit more of reality. Like, why do you think you can't do it? All right, you're missing a few. That doesn't mean you can't do it ever. Yes, maybe you can't do it right now, but perhaps we could rephrase that, right? I can't hit a kick serve yet, right? Use the power of yet. By adding that to the end of the sentence, now we're giving some hope. Hey, I'm working on it. I know that this is something that I can achieve in the future. It's not a fixed thing, right? I can surpass my level, and I understand that making mistakes along the way, that's actually reality. That's how we learn. And I think very often it's mistakes and losses that can lead to the use of the word can't with respect to winning, with respect to mistakes or learning. And it's a pretty easy, I think, fix, but I think you have to remind people often, because you'll hear them continue to use the word, that they can't do something. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the word can't, Josh, and what you've encountered with players.
Yeah, I've definitely seen it as it relates to certain strokes, right? So whether it's like I can't hit my backhand, I can't hit, a certain type of serve, or I can't beat a certain type of player. I think that's a big one that I've certainly seen a lot. I mean, whether it's in players that I've coached, whether it's in, in tournaments. I mean, you see these self-limiting beliefs come about through, maybe a player loses to a certain type of player over and over again, whether that's, very consistent player that they might decide to call a pusher, whether that's, somebody with a big serve or someone who comes to net. So it could be a certain type of player as well that that holds them back, and they have a feeling just because they haven't been winning recently, right? They haven't been beating this player recently, or they haven't been, able to produce that stroke at the level that they want to recently, that they never will. Ignoring the fact that growth is always possible. And also, I would say, not thinking about the fact of how far they've come. I think oftentimes it can be helpful, whether it's 6 months or a year, but being able to look backwards and think about the progress that has been made. I think that can often make it easier to understand that, where you are isn't fixed, that it's not like you can never beat this type of player, never, bring your serve, increase the consistency or increase the spin on your serve, that you're not fixed, and that I like that you brought up the word can't, because I think that, when that is believed, when it's believed that somebody can't do something, then it's almost a cop out before you even start. It's that gives you an excuse to lose. It gives you an excuse maybe to play poorly, and you have that excuse ready, that you have it built in, that regardless of what happens out there. And we all know that can be very random. Anything can happen on any given day. But when you've already built that up, it's as if you've prepared what you're going to say after the fact already, before the match has even started. So I like that, and I think talking to players about that word in particular is a great strategy.
And I think maybe we start to use that word, at least in the examples we're bringing up, because we're over-identifying with mistakes, thinking that it means we're bad, or losses, that we're not a good player. And if we start to look at solutions, yes, the power of yet is one, but we've mentioned a few times in this podcast about looking at your tennis, say, as a project, as a life project. So it's not, just because you can't hit a kick serve, or you can't beat that person, or you're struggling against a particular style, doesn't mean you're a terrible player. It just means you need to work on this aspect of the tennis project. And if we can look at that more with a learner's mindset, right? As you noted, Josh, the growth mindset. So for those, maybe we should define that a little bit, right? Fixed mindset being more that believing certain abilities are fixed at a certain level for all of us. So, that could be intelligence, speed, strength. And there's this notion that whatever you have is what you have, and you'll never surpass that. And then the growth mindset is more about that you can increase your levels in certain things. Obviously, teaching height is hard, but can you be smarter? Can you learn to get faster? Yeah, you can do all of these things. It's a matter of putting time and energy and the belief that you can grow that. I do think in working with athletes, and even just being somewhat self-aware myself, that we're not necessarily 100% in the growth mindset camp and 100% in the fixed mindset. I notice even sometimes that I'll have some fixed mindset thoughts that, come about, and I realize, I'm able to turn it around because I understand what's happening. But I think we all have to be more aware of that. That we might be saying something that isn't true, that, yeah, I can actually improve at this particular thing. And so I think it's important for players to examine their thoughts and, am I expressing maybe an opinion that is really more fixed mindset when I could be thinking more as a learner and looking to grow this? You made a good point, Josh, about how maybe what's happening a little bit is we see ourselves at a certain level and we're not really able to expand our view to what the next level looks like, and then the work that goes into going from, let's just say level 1 to level 2. And we're just so kind of fixated on where we are now, and maybe we're not happy with where we are now, and I can't get there. Maybe we just need to break that journey down a little bit, and I think that's where working with someone like you or me can be helpful in creating that vision of what you want to get out of tennis, and understanding, okay, what's our vision for the next 3 or 4 months, and here's what to expect. There's going to be mistakes, right? It can help them get through some of that can't stuff, get through that fixed mindset piece. And once a player has done that one time, gone through, say, a 90 or 120-day development plan and gotten to and seen improvement, then they tend to buy into it more. I think you start to see some of this fixed mindset drop off in terms of how they're talking, because now you've actually helped them grow their game in a more deliberate way, and with understanding the reality of there are mistakes, there are losses, there are difficult styles to play, but we can get through that if we look at it in a more project-oriented way. It's something we want to study and simply have a better plan for.
Yeah, I think having a development plan and having a clear vision for what that next step looks like, and being really specific about it. Maybe that means, increasing your serve percentage by a certain amount. Maybe that means making certain tactical changes. It could certainly mean, making, devoting more time to the mental aspects of the game. But I think having that clear plan and maybe setting some concrete goals or process goals for yourself can go a long way for understanding that where you're at isn't where you'll always be, and that next step is feasible. I think laying that all out like that makes it feel a lot more realistic and doable. So I think that's a great point. And to one earlier point that you made about catching yourself and noticing when those self-limiting beliefs come up. And I think this is often a theme. It's awareness, right? It's noticing it in the first place. Until that's happened, you continue on with that same path, that same way of thinking until you catch it. So I think having the awareness to notice, first of all, to understand the difference between the types of beliefs, but then to be able to catch it when it's happened and replace that thought in a certain way with something that's actually going to be more helpful and help you understand that, yes, that next, I'm not, just because maybe I'm struggling right now doesn't mean it's always going to be like this. Doesn't mean I can never improve or I can't win at that level or beat that type of player or improve this shot. So I think that goes a long way there.
You mentioned comparison earlier, really trying to compare yourself to a past version of you and seeing that you can get better. I think another self-limiting thing can be comparing ourselves to others in such a way that it makes us feel bad. And that may fuel into the whole can't discussion, because somebody else perhaps is achieving things that we wish we were achieving, or I'm working harder than that person. Why is he or she getting results? I'm not getting results. And we end up really focusing on something that we can't control, and we're letting that comparison get in the way of our own learning and of our own path. And I think when we talk about the development plan, it's really important that when working with a player, we understand that this is your unique path. That person that you're comparing yourself to, they've got different genes, they've got different training context, maybe a different coach. Perhaps they have the ability to train more. They're making different choices. There's so many different things that make the comparison of you to them not really valid. It's not a good, they're really not comparable examples. It's apples and oranges. But we see a lot of players do that. And sometimes we see even parents doing that, looking at some other junior player and seeing what they're doing. Oh, why is my player not where that player is, etc. And I think again, we have to be really careful when working with players that they understand it's a unique journey to them, and when putting a plan together, it doesn't matter what other people are doing. I mean, you can look at it and say, well, maybe that could work for me. Let me try it. But whatever other players are doing is not necessarily 100% going to be right for you. Just like, working with one coach versus another coach may be different. So for example, Josh, you might like to work with one coach. I try to work with that coach, and we don't hit it off for whatever reason. Doesn't mean it's bad or whatever. So we all have different kind of unique aspects of that. But I think when we start doing comparison, and maybe we've used this quote before on the podcast, but comparison, especially in that way, is often the thief of joy, right? It kind of sucks the joy out of the game, and then that becomes a self-limiting belief when we're more focused on what other people are doing, and when there's a lack of enjoyment in what we're doing, how can you possibly want to continue? Of course, you're gonna, of course, you're limiting your own potential because the joy isn't there.
Yeah, no, that's a great point about comparisons. It actually made me think about our last episode, our interview with Todd Martin, and how he talked about, growing up, he was never the highest ranked player. And, he also didn't, maybe train as much as some of the other kids. And I think it's very important for people to remember that everyone peaks at a different time. So some people, might peak early in adolescence or later on in their high school years or college years or beyond. But understanding that people do have these peaks at different times, and that just because somebody is ranked higher or able to do certain things on the court now, that could certainly change over time. One player could burn out, one player could get injured. Again, going back to this point that where you're at today isn't where you'll always be. So I think having the perspective to understand that there are those ups and downs, that that also that improvement, sometimes it's a one step back, two steps forward type of thing, where if you're actively working on a certain shot or a new way of thinking, there can be some growing pains along the way. So I think we talk a lot on the show about the process, right? That process of trying to get better, not just staying focused on the outcome. And I think the big reason is because staying focused on the outcome doesn't actually help you achieve those outcomes that you want. When you focus on the process of playing great tennis, of improving, as you've said, Brian, trying to find that recipe of high performance that works best for you. That's ultimately when you start to improve. That's ultimately when you start taking your game to the next level. But comparing yourself based on UTR or rankings, and I get it. I mean, I've been there, first of all, and second of all, I understand that these things are important. These things can be very important, right? Having a certain ranking or UTR or winning certain matches allows you to do certain things, right? It may allow you to play in that next match and in a later round, or make it onto a certain college team or whatever it is. But understanding that by fixating on the outcome rather than thinking about that process of these different areas that are going to contribute to that outcome, you're not necessarily doing everything in your power to get where you want to be.
And focus on the process, I think, is actually a solution to having an kind of overly focusing on winning. I think overly focusing on winning is actually a self-limiting behavior, because it's something you can't control. And when we're overly focused on winning, maybe we have too much of our ego is invested, or we're putting a lot of pressure on ourselves. Certainly some matches we want to win those because, they may open up other opportunities. Like you said, whether it's making a college team or having your college team do something, or even your adult league team. Maybe you're in a sectional championship and your team wants to go to nationals. But if you're just thinking about winning, and then it's not happening, there's going to be a lot of anger. There's going to be some frustration, definite loss of enjoyment. And usually those emotions don't lead to your best performance. So you're actually limiting yourself. These are self-limiting behaviors, self-limiting beliefs. And by going to your process, keeping it simple, we did the full focus episode. I think that's a really great solution to that over focus on winning while you're playing, or even overly focused on winning as part of your kind of overall mindset to your career. Because the better we get at understanding our process, understanding our recipe, the better we're going to play more often, right? We're not going to be limiting ourselves. We're going to be looking at the things that we can control. And so the process and being fully focused is always a good solution. But in this case, it's really good in terms of helping with some self-limiting behaviors or thought patterns that we have during a match, right, or just in our career.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing about focusing on the outcome is that it puts a lot of pressure on us, right? I mean, going back to a conversation that we had with Brian Barker, who's coached at the highest level, just this difference between two people, one who's going to, try to focus on their strategy and make sure that their game plan against, their opponent is right, and focus on their effort and focus on some of the mental aspects, like being able to reset and being able to, use your time wisely on court and prepare and review and focusing on all of these winning ingredients, rather than that person where it's, yes, that's all true, but I also need to win, right? Should win, right? Using those types of words. You brought up can't. I think those words like need and should also do a lot to hold. Exactly. I think that those sorts of words and that way of thinking holds us back because it really puts a lot of pressure on us, and it almost sets us up for more disappointment and a lower self concept or self image if you don't live up to that because you feel like it's expected. So I think I think this also goes back to this concept of expectations versus standards that we've talked about a lot on this show, right? Making sure, and this all ties into the process, but making sure that you're setting your own standards high for yourself in a number of different areas, right? Whether it's some of these other things related to your sport performance, hydration, nutrition, sleep, certainly the mental and physical aspects of the game. But by really focusing on these areas and understanding that the outcome is out of your control and saying, I'm going to try to do everything possible to, reach the highest level in these different areas. And, I know that certain things are out of my control. I know there's always the element of luck or, other people making decisions, good days and bad days, but understanding over time that those are the ingredients to performing at higher and higher levels.
And you mentioned phrases like have to, need to, or I should. Typically, if we go back to Lisa Feldman Barrett's theory of constructed emotions, those types of thoughts tend to create debilitative types of emotions. They don't help us at all. And so it's really good for us to understand that we're using that kind of irrational language because you don't have to win. Like nothing terrible is going to happen. Of course, you want to win, but we're using these words in such a way that, like you said, we're putting pressure on, but we're in a way thinking there's bigger consequences here than there really are. And so the more rational we can be about these things, because the reality is you don't have to win the next point. It would be great, it'd be optimal, perhaps, to win the next point, but there's always another point. Or there's always another game. Oftentimes there's another match. There's another opportunity for your team to get to nationals or whatever. And so nothing really truly terrible will happen. So we have to understand that the language that we use in our thoughts or in our specific self-talk does drive specific emotions. And these emotions are either going to help you perform well or they're going to get in the way. And so those are, some important things to think about as we're competing in the moment, but also looking at, progressing in our career.
Absolutely. I think you brought up, I think this concept of catastrophizing, which happens with a lot of people, right? Thinking that, if I lose this match, then I can't, then I'm a bad tennis player. Or if I lose this match, then I should just quit. Right. I mean, these are certainly things I've heard from players. And it's, understanding that journey as a tennis player, our project as a tennis player is a long one, or hopefully it's a long one. And that there will be those ups and downs along the way. There will be matches in every single player's career that they feel like they shouldn't have lost, or feel like you lost to a player whose level was lower, or you had a bad day. But understanding that is normal, that's happened to, even the top players in the world, they've had those days. I mean, I think we can think about, any top professional, and think of matches where they lost to somebody ranked lower, or they didn't perform well, or they were in a winning position, perhaps maybe they had match points and lost. So I think having that perspective that these things happen to players regardless of level goes a long way for understanding that whatever's happening right now or whatever happened in my last match doesn't define me. That's just one data point, and hopefully I'm going to learn from it and not just push it aside and not think about it, which I would say happens a lot. But trying to learn from it and trying to really think about it. Okay, in the future, what would I do in that situation? So that it can change your thinking from I lost that match to such and such player because I'm not a good player to, okay, I lost. And if I could look back, there were moments there where maybe I wasn't fully focused or prepared for that next point. Or there was an adjustment that I could have made during that match that I didn't, or maybe your certain shots were off, right? Maybe your serve wasn't, you weren't finding that consistency on that day. And maybe it's okay, the adjustment needs to be made that maybe I needed to put more spin on the ball. Or maybe I need to devote more time to working on my serve. But, I think that reflection process can help tennis players understand that, number one, why performances take place and hopefully learn from them, but also can do a lot to help people avoid that, themselves identifying too much with any one given result.
Let's keep going on that identification piece, because I think another self-limiting belief or thought process is the self-image that we have, that conceptualization of who we are as a player and so forth. I'm going to ask you to talk more about imposter syndrome, see how that fits in with this. Okay. One of the questions that's on the mental performance profile that I have players fill out is it's on a 1 to 7 scale, and the statement is, my mind is a weapon on the court. And it's very interesting to see how people rate themselves on that. And if you rate yourself lower, what does that mean? So this is where we're talking about self-image, that if you don't see your mind as a weapon, or if you see yourself as someone who can't win big points or big matches, maybe again we're being fixed mindset, we're over-identifying, but it's really important that you understand that the way you perceive yourself and those abilities about winning, or ability to achieve your goals is very, very important towards improving. And it's another, thought to try to develop some more self-awareness about is, do I put some limits on my ability to win, to beat other players? Do I put some limits on my ability to use my skills or think that my mind can be helpful out there? I was actually playing with somebody the other day. He actually doesn't even know it. He puts like limits on how much he tries. He's not even aware that he's constantly training at 75%. And until I brought it up and demonstrated what, more than 75% looked like, he didn't even get it. Couldn't understand what I was talking about. So some of us may not even be aware, but we've got to be understanding some of the thoughts that are coming through our head with respect to my ability to win, my ability to improve, because those things are important, because you're kind of baking that into your self-image. And I came across a quote today. This is I read this quote in Dan Abraham's book about Soccer Tough 2. Which, even though it's about soccer, I'd recommend it to everybody. But he quoted this French philosopher and said, "It is our duty as men and women to proceed as though the limits of our abilities do not exist." I really like that. Now, that doesn't mean that, Josh, you and I, we're going to go out to the track and we're going to all of a sudden be, faster than Usain Bolt if we just keep working at it, or whatever, right? But if we can This removes those self-imposed limits. This is saying, all right, just go after it as if you could be the best that you could be. Don't get in your own way. So I'd love to hear, your perspective on maybe some of the self-image things that we kind of conceptualize and what you've seen with different players.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that players can do to build that self-image. I mean, we've talked about some of these methods, like using a confidence journal, for instance, and being intentional and consistent about noting down when you do things well, when you've made certain improvements. So I think that can go a long way. But I think also, having that personal philosophy about really who you are and what you stand for goes a long way for understanding when maybe when you're falling short or when you're not exerting that full effort or doing everything that you could do in a certain situation. One thing that I would also add from before is thinking about the goals that we set for ourselves, and trying to find that balance between those goals that will push us, right, and not be self-limiting in the goals that we set in the first place, right? Not setting goals just based on where we are right now or that last result, but setting goals that that inspire us to achieve more, but are also attainable and realistic, right? So finding that balance between what's going to really inspire us and push us, motivate us to get to that next level and to make those improvements, understanding that our level's not fixed, but also understanding that setting of goals and not achieving them also can backfire in terms of our self-belief and self-confidence. So trying to, I mean, if you think about the SMART goals framework that we've talked about, that attainable and realistic piece, finding that happy balance between what do those goals look like that do really inspire us and motivate us. And I think for some players it's different, right? Some players they need that huge goal. They need that goal of, okay, I want to be number one in the world. Where for another player, that goal is to move up in the lineup, right? Or to whatever it is. And then, being able to break that down into goals and into, a development plan, and having that vision. But I think, no, I think that goes a long way, and not, I think that quote, it allows people to almost imagine what it would be like if nothing was holding them back.
Right.
Because oftentimes those things are really just in their head, things that you're repeating to yourself. That that power of narrative and storytelling, right, and the way that we view ourselves and sort of the story that we tell ourselves about us and where we're at and why the way things why the way things are. So I think that way of thinking does a lot to start to move past those types of beliefs. So no, I think that's a great quote. I mean, to not focus on those limits of our abilities, but be able to imagine what it would be like to be able to move past it, because I think that's really step one. Having that belief that you can move past it and can get to that next level is critical, is essential to moving past it and to improving.
But it's also scary in a way because where we are is comfortable. And what this quote is saying to us is that, well, if you can take the limits off, take sort of the governor off of what you're doing, um, the sky's the limit, perhaps. But along the way, you're going to have to get really uncomfortable in that process. And I think sometimes when we're limiting ourselves, we're really protecting our own self-esteem, perhaps. And I think what goes along with this, and it's something we've discussed on past episodes, is can we have the courage to get uncomfortable? Can we be courageous enough to really go for the dream? Because so many people don't. And this is, again, another self-awareness thing, is that we're probably all at times limiting our dreams to a certain degree, some more than others. And again, it's pursuing dreams is potentially an uncomfortable pursuit. For those of us who are on that path. And I think it's one of those things where, like we mentioned earlier, the first time you do the development plan, then you get a little bit of experience with that level of discomfort. Now you're ready to maybe increase that level of discomfort, and you start to rewire your brain a bit about how that goes. And this is slightly unrelated to that, but there's a video that I watched with one of my figure skating students, and it talked about how figure skaters actually rewire their brain in terms of many of the jumps and difficult moves that they do. And they're actually suppressing the thoughts of injury and survival as they learn to do jumps, a single axle to a double axle to a triple axle. I mean, these are really potentially dangerous things that they're doing. I mean, they're literally flinging themselves in the air, twisting around, and then landing on a blade. And super difficult to do that. And, can you imagine, somebody who's never done that, Josh, like all of a sudden, all right, yeah, I want you to just get on this skate and just jump. And you're going to have all kinds of alarm bells ringing in your mind, right? But through that process of learning, they start to be able to rewire their brain so that they don't feel that level of discomfort anymore. They're able to fling themselves into the air. And I think we can do a similar thing when it comes to striving for, our best, whether that be professionally, academically, in tennis. And it's all about discomfort, and it's all about helping you understand that a lot of the alarms going off in your mind are just getting in the way. They're not real. Like, your life is not really in danger here, but those are the alarms that are going off. So I think it's, the more that we do it, and I think the goals, like you said, is really important. I think the development plan is really important. Using like a 90 or 120 day development plan. For those who've seen Eric Buderak's TED Talk, for some people, big goals don't work. They can be paralyzing. Although I would say, for those players who have such big goals, did they also have smaller goal plans that help them along the way and keep it in perspective? Right. I don't necessarily know. I would say most people don't have that, and they may just have these expectations. Like, there's, I think, a difference between a goal and an expectation, and so these can be some things that are getting in the way as well.
Yeah, there's another great quote. I think it's, a goal without a plan is just a wish, right? So it's great to want something for yourself, and that's certainly a part of it. But no, until you take that time to really break it down and understand what it takes to get to that next level, to make the improvements, then it's really tough to get there. I mean, you talked about, having that big goal for yourself, right? Whatever it is. But until you can really take the time to really think about the different steps along the way, and having the perspective to understand, what that improvement process will look like, then it's going to be really hard to get there. I think also, this concept of perfectionism, and expecting that we're going to be perfect, and expecting that nothing's going to go wrong, or we're not going to have certain roadblocks along the way. I think that's something that definitely holds a lot of players back, can be definitely a self-limiting belief, in that each loss, or each time something goes wrong, or you view it as going wrong, it has more of that potential to derail all the progress that you've been making. So I think having that sort of a mindset is, number one, unrealistic, because it assumes that nothing will ever go wrong. You look at any professional player, any player that's played the sport for long enough, and they've had those ups and downs. They've had, as we talked about, matches that haven't gone their way, or injuries, or whatever it is, or just times, weeks, months where maybe you don't notice the improvements, or you don't feel like you're making improvements. But not not thinking in that perfectionist way goes a long way to being able to bounce back after defeat, and having the perspective that yes, this is normal, and that this is part of the improvement process.
I agree that perfectionism can be self-limiting, um, but there's also a positive side to it, where
Mm-hmm.
generally perfectionists have high standards. Now, the problem comes in the journey to those high standards. Are mistakes and losses tolerable? If they're not, and what we often see are anger and frustration, and those get in the way of good performance, and those emotions also get in the way of you making improvement overall, because you're constantly judging what's happening, and you may over identify with that again. And so a good book for people who may think that they're perfectionists and that gets in the way is by Tal Ben Shahar. It's called The Pursuit of Perfect. And he's a great person to talk about it because he's a self-proclaimed perfectionist he was a world-class squash player before becoming a professor and a doctor in psychology, in positive psychology. And he actually moved from Israel to the UK to train with the number one player in the world. And he was such a perfectionist that he pushed himself to the point where he had such a serious injury that his career was over. He could no longer compete. And so the book talks a lot about a better way of looking at the world is by what he calls being an optimalist rather than a perfectionist. Be an optimalist, somebody who's always looking for the best that they can see, that having reality be a part of what they do. So really useful book for those who feel like maybe perfectionism is getting in their way. And for whatever reason, I don't know. I think Josh, tennis seems to attract a lot of perfectionists.
Absolutely. I mean, whether it's, that it's a more technical sport compared to some other
Mm-hmm.
sports, or the fact that it's an individual and it's just you out there most of the time, or the fact that, many top players started playing the game at such a young age, right? Specialized early. That could also attract perfectionists to the sport, or could bring out maybe the perfectionism in people in those positions. So no, I think that is a good observation. And as we've talked about so many times in this podcast, tennis is a really challenging sport, and playing in a match is very mentally and emotionally challenging, right? After every point, there's that instant feedback on you either won it or you lost it. Now, if you view it in, hey, I'm a winner right now, and after this next point, I'm a loser, and then I'm a loser, and then I'm a winner, and you ride that emotional roller coaster, then it's gonna be really tough. But I think by developing some of these skills, that some of these sports psychology skills, it gives you the ability to, number one, have that perspective, and understand that this is normal, this is the way tennis matches work, but also be able to use some of these practical skills like breathing, like being able to reset, and that helps you not ride that emotional roller coaster, understanding that how a match is won ultimately.
And if there's a sport that you don't need to be perfect in, it's tennis. You can lose so many points and still win. Um, your style of play does not need to be pretty. I was mentioning figure skating before. There's no artistic expression score or, aesthetically pleasing strokes score. None of that matters. And if you lose a game or you lose a point, there's always another one. And it doesn't matter if you made a mistake where a shot missed the line by a quarter inch or if it missed by 10 feet. It's the same. It's only 1 point, right? So, yeah, it doesn't, yeah, if we can keep that in mind, that the sport doesn't require you to be perfect. It's constantly giving you chances to start over as we go through. Um, can we touch on maybe one last thing, Josh? Is you had brought up when we were discussing this earlier the idea of imposter syndrome. How might that be a self-limiting belief?
I think it's a big one. I think from what I've seen in athletes, once you get to a certain level, whatever level that is, and that's going to vary based on the person. It can be very easy to, look around and see other players and think that perhaps you haven't earned where you're at, right? You haven't maybe worked as hard as other people. You haven't, fully deserved to be at this point. It could be a player that makes a breakthrough in a tournament and makes it to the semifinals or the finals for the first time. Could be a player who maybe has taken that next step in their journey onto a new team. Maybe it's a college team, or maybe it's a competitive USTA team, or they're bumped up a USTA, an NTRP level. They just went from 3.5 to 4.0, and their self-image is still that of a 3.5. And they still view themselves as that 3.5. And all of a sudden they're playing other 4.0s, and they've always seen 4.0s, 4.0 player as something that's, this really high level, something that they can't attain, or that's, so much better than them. And all of a sudden these thoughts are going through their mind that I don't deserve to be here. These people are so much better than me. And there are all these quotes as well of professional athletes and people that are the best in the world at their craft, talking about imposter syndrome, talking about how even though they've done it time and time again, they still get these thoughts that this is that they don't deserve to be there, or that things aren't going to go well because they're not actually as good as they claim to be, or they're supposed to be. So I think understanding that these thoughts are normal, and maybe preparing, having prepared responses that you script out, and that this can have to do with that confidence journal, or that preparation of confidence, by really thinking about our past positive performances, thinking about maybe it's the progress we've made, thinking about other matches with positive results, but being able to effectively argue against that voice in our head that is that that contains that imposter syndrome goes a long way to overcoming it.
Yeah, and again, it's back to the self-image, back to maybe we're protecting ourselves in some way. And I think the way I'd like to close it is with that quote again, just so that people remember what it is. It is our duty as men and women to proceed as though the limits of our abilities do not exist. That's a great counter to limiting ourselves, right? To self-limiting beliefs and self-limiting behaviors. So I think that's a great way to kind of end the conversation. Thank you, Josh, for this. And thank all of you for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. You can also check us out on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.